Good morning, everyone. I am Valita Davis, the Executive Director for Asha Karen Array of Hope. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our annual CCCI, our Cultural Competency in Crisis Intervention Conference. The theme for today's conference is engaging and empowering the Latino community. It is indeed our hope that you will enjoy, engage, and receive the wonderful outcomes of enhanced cultural awareness. Thank you for your attendance, and again, welcome.
Thank you so much, Valita. It's very appreciated. So our first speaker for the day is already coming up on screen. Perfect. Her name is Damary Rodriguez. She works for an organization up north called Esperanza United. I think she might be our speaker that's the furthest away during this conference. I'm actually not positive about that. But I'm going to let her introduce herself. We're very excited for her presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca. As Rebecca said, I'm Damary Rodriguez, and I want to thank Rebecca and Melissa and Asha Karen for inviting me here today. I am the Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator with Esperanza United, and I am actually, yes, in Pennsylvania, so I am a little further up north than some of y'all, but I'm really excited to be here today. I'm actually going to, before I get started, I'm going to share my PowerPoint, which I will be presenting in English, but the PowerPoint is bilingual. So for folks who want to follow along, I'm going to share that in the chat if I can. Actually, I don't think I can share it in the chat. I can't. I'm sorry, y'all. That is my fault. I thought I could do that. That's okay. We'll send it out afterwards. But I am going to start sharing my screen. And there we go. Can everyone see my screen?
Looks great.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So I am Damary Rodriguez, as I said, Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator at Esperanza United. I have been working in the field to end gender-based violence for the past 7 years or so. I got started at my local rape crisis shelter, rape crisis center / domestic violence shelter program, and then worked at my state coalition to end sexual assault, the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape. And then I joined Esperanza United late last year. And I'm really excited to talk about understanding Latina realities, our Latina advocacy framework, in part because I myself am Latina. I'm Dominican Latina raised in New York City, but I am just one Latina that is part of a large community across the US and Latin America that's going to try to encompass all of that into a hour or so presentation. So before we dive into the content today, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Esperanza United, which is an organization that mobilizes Latinas and Latina communities to end gender-based violence. We used to be called Casa de Esperanza. We changed our name last year, and we used to be called Casa de Esperanza, and then our national project, which I'm a part of, was called the National Latino Network. And Esperanza United was founded in 1982 by a small group of Latina women as an emergency shelter in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is where our our home base is, as we call it. And it continues to operate today with an emergency shelter, as well as other programming, such as prevention and what we call family advocacy. And yeah, we do that locally and nationwide. So, and again, we'll send out this PowerPoint or PDF afterwards. And I just wanted to begin by talking about the at or arroba that we use in a lot of our materials. We have, as it says on the screen, we've chosen to use the at in place of the o when referring to groups of people that are gender neutral, gender expansive, masculine, feminine, because we're trying to be gender inclusive. We realize that the at symbol or the arroba is not perfect. It still kind of falls into the gender binary, that only men and women exist as gender identities, which is not the case. I think as we learn more and more, we're learning that there are all types of genders. So although we use the at symbol, I will often, even throughout this presentation, use multiple ways of talking about Latino folks, including Latine, Latinx, Chicanx, Hispanic, Hispana, Hispano, and because that is, as I kind of said in the beginning, you know, we're a huge community, and I myself, even though I grew up as a Latina on the East Coast, that is a very different experience compared to, and also US born, compared to someone who maybe immigrated here, or someone who grew up in a border town, or is growing up in the rural South, or so on and so forth, right? We're not a monolith. But I do want to talk a little bit about the usage of these terms, because everybody uses different terms differently. And I know there's been a lot of talk about the use of Latinx, and some folks are really reluctant to use it. And that's fine. I think people should be able to identify and refer to themselves how they want to. I would never want to pressure someone into using a particular term, but I think it's important to also respect the terminology that other people use and how they want to identify themselves as. So I myself, use Latina or Latinx a lot, but I don't expect other people to necessarily use that. I just ask that people respect that I use that terminology, because for lots of reasons, but including that I'm a queer person who is really involved in my queer community. And I know that there are a lot of Latina folks that like to use that term. So I'm just going to go over quickly some of the really quick definitions of what Hispanic, Chicana, Chicanx, Latino, Latinx refer to. So Hispanic really refers to folks who are Spanish speaking. It is a term that was first adopted by the US government under Richard Nixon, excuse me, and was first used in the 1980 census. In my personal experience, I find that older communities within the Latina community tend to use this term, but it also just depends too. Latino refers more so to the geography, specifically people from Latin America. So it can include anybody from Mexico all the way down to the tip of South America, including the Caribbean. And there's even some argument about whether some countries such as Belize, for example, would be considered part of Latin America. Geographically, yes, but I think culturally they would not be Hispanic, for example, because in Belize they primarily speak English. So it's always kind of up for debate. and it continues to change over time. And I think it's becoming, the Latino and Latinx are kind of becoming increasingly popular, depending on where you live. Latinx, which is a hotly contested word, I've heard different origin stories around Latinx. I've heard that it originated in Central America by queer and trans activists there in trying to reclaim some of the indigenous languages that were spoken in what is now considered Central America. I've also heard some people say that it originated in academia. According to the information that I have, it started being used around the mid-2000s within activist circles to disrupt the gender binary, and to get away from using a lot of the gendered language, which is really part of Spanish. If you are a Spanish speaker, you know that Spanish and some of the other Romance languages like French are very gendered and tend to, you know, subjects and objects either have like a feminine gender or a masculine gender. And it started to become really popular within the last few years, the use of Latinx. And I think more so within, as I said, trans and queer communities. And more recently, people are using Latine, just because the X can feel difficult to say for native Spanish speakers, and Latine kind of feels more natural because we tend to, you know, use a lot of O's and A's in Spanish. So the E comes more naturally versus using the X. So it's kind of a personal choice. And then Chicano and Chicanx are very specific to folks who tend to have Mexican ancestry. And it's often been used to just reclaim that identity and ancestry. I tend to find that it is more common to be used in the Western US and Southwest US. I haven't heard it used as much here in Pennsylvania and in New York. But, you know, it's, it's kind of, like I said, we're not a monolith as a community. So you're gonna find that people have different terms that they use for themselves, depending on their ancestry, their national origin, all these different things that play into people's identities. There we go. And then I just wanted to talk also in terms of terminology, to also talk about undocumented and versus the use of the word illegal. I know that the word illegal was one that was used to describe folks who have immigrated here without documentation for many years. And increasingly, we are using the word undocumented just because the word illegal is dehumanizing. And it criminalizes people. And we want to stay away from that because a lot of the people that are coming here are often coming here because they're escaping violence or conditions that are really harmful in their home country or home, you know, area where they're from. So when referring to people who have immigrated here and are not documented, you really want to use the term undocumented versus illegal, because a lot of the work, a lot of the folks that I'm seeing in the chat, a lot of us do essentially what is social services, or I would even call human rights work. And because we're doing that work, we want to use terminology that is empowering and that humanizes the people that we serve. And we want to stay away from terminology or words that are going to dehumanize, you know, participants, clients, survivors, etc. I may use all of those words interchangeably as well. I often use the word survivor because I'm often talking about survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault in the work that I do. But Esperanza United tends to use the word participant. I know a lot of folks use the word client, so I may use all of those words interchangeably as well. All right, we're gonna start getting down to the nitty gritty and talking about learning objectives. We're hoping to increase awareness of the realities and complexities of Latino communities in the US. We want to review responses to survivors utilizing the Latina Advocacy Framework, which is a framework that Esperanza United created, and we'll get into that later on. And we also want to help build organizational capacity to respond to Latino survivors. All right, guiding principles. So I wasn't sure if we were going to do like a webinar or Zoom meeting, so I often have guiding principles in my presentations, regardless of the platform we're using. I still think these guiding principles are important to talk about, just because you know, sometimes when you're learning new things, for those of you who some of these topics may be new or newer, sometimes it can be stuff that it's like hard to process. It takes a while. It can be jarring at times. So I always think it's good to just remind folks to be mindful of your thoughts, reactions, and body language. I see this is recorded, so you know, I think you can probably step away if you need to, if some of this is hard. I know a lot of the people that I've worked with, myself included, are survivors. So some of this stuff can bring things up for you. Don't be afraid to step away. Like, if you have questions about anything that I talk about today, I will share my contact information at the end. And you can feel free to follow up with me personally. I'm happy to talk through things more in depth. But don't feel like you have to stick around. This isn't school. You don't have to ask permission to go to the bathroom or anything like that. And of course, just make sure to reflect on your own privilege and biases. I always want to create and maintain a safe learning space. I ask that folks do that as well with me. We're all doing this together. To be self-aware, to share space, honor diversity, and to be present. And if you can't be present, that's cool. Like I said, step away. All right. Examining culture, what it is and how it impacts our work. I never assume that we all have the same knowledge when we're in a space together. We're all at different places. I kind of talked about that already a little bit, but I just want to make that plain that, you know, we're all doing different things in this work, and have different identities, different experiences, which shapes our knowledge. So, yeah, don't feel like if you don't know a thing, it's cool. I didn't know all the things at one point, or the things that I know now, and I'm also still learning too. So, yeah. So, what is culture? And I think I messed up the slide, but it's cool. So culture is a lot of different things. It's all around us, and it's in us, and it's everywhere all at the same time, which is like wild when you think about it, but it is. But culture is a lot of different things. It's also, to just put it simply, it's a pattern of beliefs, attitudes, behaviors, that are transmitted from generation to generation that allow us to adapt to each other and the environment. It's dynamic, it changes, it's always changing. And it's, as it says on the screen, it's learned, it's shared, it's systemic, dynamic, it's symbolic. So it can sometimes be really tangible, like for example, food or music. And sometimes it's just, you know, not tangible. It can be, um, you know, how we act as a society or how we respond to things. So yeah, and that it's important for us to talk about what is culture, because I think we have this idea that it's, you know, it's set in stone, or that this is just the way that it is, but it's not, right? Like the culture that we have now as a society isn't the same culture that we had 50 years ago. And it's not the same culture. Like I said, when I started, I grew up on the East Coast in New York City. That culture is not the same culture that's in Pennsylvania. For example, I live in Eastern, kind of South Central Pennsylvania, which has a large Mennonite and Amish and German community. Very different from a Dominican girl from New York City versus, for example, I recently was in the Midwest. I visited Minnesota. Culture there is very different. Just as I'm sure the culture in Minnesota is very different from culture in Alabama, right? The geography and all these different things can impact the way that our culture looks and feels and sounds and tastes and all these different things. So I just kind of want to set that up as we start to talk about Latino communities. And getting into, some of y'all may have heard some of these words before: cultural competence, cultural responsiveness, and cultural humility. I think as we even, yeah, the conference itself, right, includes some of this terminology. As social service workers or human rights workers, it's really important that we have an understanding of what these different terms mean and how we may incorporate this into our work, or where we are in terms of, you know, whether we're practicing cultural competence, cultural responsiveness, or cultural humility. So I'm going to explain these. So cultural competence is, the goal of it is to build an understanding of minority cultures. I use that in quotes because that can change depending on where you are, who's considered a minority culture and who's considered part of the dominant culture. But the goal is to build an understanding of minority cultures to better and more appropriately provide services. So it values knowledge and training. And it allows for people to strive to obtain a goal. It promotes skill building. And it's a great idea, right, to try to become competent in another culture. But that can be a shortcoming too, like to enforce the idea that someone can become competent in a culture other than one's own. It can support the idea that cultures are monolithic, and it is often based on academic knowledge rather than lived experiences, and believes that professionals can be certified in a culture, which is not necessarily possible because as we said before, culture is dynamic and it's changing. So yeah, it's hard to get to a place where you can be competent, right? That's a learning about culture is kind of a never-ending process. So that kind of brings us to the next term, cultural responsiveness. Cultural responsiveness is more about respect for difference, eagerness to learn, and willingness to accept that there are many ways of viewing the world. It avoids overgeneralizing or characterizing general cultural groups in a rigid or like one-dimensional or static way. So it's a little kind of a step beyond cultural competence. And I think it's sort of in the name, even responsive, respond, right? So you're kind of responding to the culture. And then the last term that we have here, cultural humility, is more about the goal is to encourage personal reflection and growth around culture in order to increase a service provider's awareness. It values introspection and co-learning, and it's kind of never ending because it encourages lifelong learning. There's no end goal to it. And some folks would say that it puts professionals and clients in a mutually beneficial relationship. So it attempts to diminish power dynamics, which is really helpful when you're serving survivors of gender-based violence, because they've often had their power taken away from them. So you want to try to, empower a survivor when you're working with them. And you want to challenge power dynamics, right? So this is really helpful. There can be shortcomings, just like with the other two, is that I think it can be hard for people to grasp the idea of learning with and from survivors, or challenging like those power dynamics. And I think it feels hard to, because of that not having an end result, it feels difficult. Like there isn't a final stage of learning. So in some fields, like depending on what field you're in, it can be hard to grasp that concept. And then still just talking about cultural competence, cultural responsiveness, and cultural humility. Ooh, sorry, y'all. My slide is doing some stuff. Yeah, so on the continuum, I think as time has gone on, at least in my field, we tend to value cultural humility the most. But that doesn't mean that one is quote unquote better than the other, or, you shouldn't, that if you're practicing cultural competence, that you're not doing good work, or that if you're practicing cultural responsiveness, that you're not doing good work. I think if you're practicing any of these things, you're doing good work, right? You're working towards something. You're working towards understanding, you know, groups and cultures that may be different from your own. And I think oftentimes you're probably doing maybe a little bit of all of these things, we're not always necessarily doing just one thing. And we'll see that later on in the presentation when we talk about the different types of organizations. So even though this continuum kind of exists or has been created, you know, that doesn't mean that if you're on one part of this continuum that you're not like good enough, because especially if we're talking about, like, as I mentioned with cultural humility, the work is never ending, right? So, let's say you feel like you've reached a place where you're culturally competent, then you may want to move towards cultural responsiveness, right? Or then move to cultural humility. And then that means that you're going to be doing the work. But there's kind of something freeing about that too, right? Knowing that you're not ever going to reach a final stage or perfection, and that's okay, right? Yeah, just going to show the Spanish slide, and we're going to move on to how can stereotypes be harmful to survivors and victims of crime? So, sorry, I'm just trying to pull up the chat and see if folks would be willing to chime in the chat of how do you think that stereotypes can be harmful to survivors or victims of crime? And if you just want to type it in the chat, I'll give folks a minute to think about it and then type that in there. All right, I'm seeing some Some answers here. Minimize empathy and response for help. Yes. Victim blaming causes them not to open up. Victims aren't taken seriously or their concerns are dismissed. It downplays their experience, can contribute to not being seen, minimizing their humanity. These are really great answers, y'all. Thank you. It creates bias of what you think a victim looks like. Yes, we're going to get into that shortly about bias. Victim blaming, racial profiling. Yes, thank you, Emily. Absolutely. That definitely plays into it. Assumptions. I don't think I've ever seen so many people type in the chat. This is awesome. I love it. Assumptions, it makes them feel like they're not being heard. Victim blaming keeps them in the role of victim. Yes, these are great answers. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, absolutely. So stereotypes can be harmful to victims because of all these things that you just said, right? It prevents them from accessing services, right? It can deny them services. And yeah, just quickly, I think a lot of us know what stereotypes are or what discrimination is, but I am just going to briefly define those things. So stereotypes would be characterizing or labeling social or ethnic groups on the basis of preconceived, usually negative labels without regard to accuracy, individuality, or humanity. And discrimination kind of builds off of that, right? So it's when an individual or group's words, acts, or failures to act can violate the dignity and human or social rights of an individual or group of people. So yeah, the things that y'all mentioned come up in this chart that I have here, right? People make assumptions or they blame survivors for what happened to them. You know, if people have bias or if we play into these stereotypes, we assume that there's something wrong with the survivor, that these differences that they have that are different from us, difference in quotation marks, because what is difference, are the source of the victim's problem, right? Which leads to blaming. You caused this, right? We know some of the things that come up when survivors of domestic violence or sexual assault, sometimes people will say things like, what were you wearing? Or why did you stay? Rather than why did this violence happen? Right? That's the question I think we really need to ask, rather than what did someone do, right? Or assuming or blaming them for what happened, and actually saying, why did this violence happen? What caused this violence? And not what the survivor did, but what is happening, whether societally or community-wise, to cause violence. Oh, and that leads me to this part about critical analysis. So these assumptions and blaming, victim blaming, racial profiling, all these things that we talked about, it may seem harmless, right? Oh, I just have this idea about a person, but it does cause harm, right? It can prevent a survivor from accessing the services that they need, because we as service providers are in a role of power. Sorry, I'm just realizing this image is weird. This free stock image selection is not great, y'all. So this is what came up for power that wasn't weird or offensive. But getting back to what I really want to talk about is, right, assumptions and blaming can seem harmless, right? Oh, it's just my idea about this person. But as service providers, we actually have power, right? And it can be hard to understand that. It can be hard to feel like, oh, me, little old me, has power. But as a service provider, you do have power, right? You work in an institution that has access to services that these survivors need, right? And I know that it can be hard to feel like you have power, especially if you've experienced any sort of oppression or marginalization, right? I know it's something I've had to come to terms with as a service provider of like, how do I have power, right? Like I've experienced racism and xenophobia and sexism and all sorts of things. And it's like, well, how can I have power? Well, power is complicated and it can shift. It can be contextual. So you as a person in this role as a service provider, you can be seen as a gateway or a gatekeeper of resources. So if you make these assumptions about someone or blame them for the violence that they experienced or the violence that happened to them, you can actually gatekeep those resources unintentionally without realizing it. So it's really important that as a service provider, you understand the power that you can have, um, and how that power can prevent people from getting the resources that they so desperately need or want. Um, and I know that can be hard. It requires some introspection, as we said, with cultural humility. Um, but yeah, it can change, right? And I know it's not even just marginalization or oppression, right? It can even feel like you don't have power because you've been pushing for change, say within your organization or within your community, and it's not happening. Or, sometimes it feels like you're yelling from the rooftops about the messed up things that are happening and no one's listening to you. But that's kind of how, unfortunately, power works sometimes, is that it can be hard to see when you have it or when you don't have it. Um, and when you're working within an institution, you do have some power, because you are a representative of an organization. So it's really important to keep your bias and your victim blaming and your assumptions in check. And it's okay if you have them. We all do. We're all part of the same society and culture that's been taught all these things. And sometimes, like, you have to do that really hard, active work of looking within and saying, oh, wait a minute, am I projecting or am I bringing my own experiences or biases into the situation? Um, and that's okay. I'm not here to shame anyone. I know I've had those experiences too, and I have to continue to work to unpack that stuff and dismantle it within myself. But when you do that internally, it impacts the work that you do, and it impacts your fellow service providers too, right? Because it builds that muscle that helps you challenge them and challenge yourself, and then services are more accessible in turn when you do that work. All right, we're gonna dive into Latino culture a little bit. Probably gonna do this part quickly because I think folks are probably gonna talk a little bit more and expand on this, but this is more so about statistically where we are in the US in terms of how many Latinos live here. And according to the US Census, the 2020 Census, there are approximately 60 million Latina folks living in the US. So it's about 18%. I say this with a caveat. I love data. I appreciate census data. And we also know that data can be flawed and it's not always accurate, right? So it could be higher than this or even lower. I tend to think it's higher than what the census says because, as we know, there were issues with the census. There's often underreporting, but this is the data that we have, so we're going to use this data today. Okay, cool. Just seeing what time I have. I have about 30 minutes. I'm going to try and get through this. About 30% of Latina folks are in the US are foreign born, and about 75% were born in the US, give or take. And an estimated over 2 million Latina folks identify as LGBTQ. Among all Latinx adults, 5.6 identify as LGBTQ. And this is the Spanish slide. I just wanted to talk a little bit about Latina folks in Alabama. So I'll be honest with y'all, it was a bit difficult to find some data for Alabama. I was kind of frustrated with that. And I don't know if some of that is just bias amongst organizations. I feel like there's a lot of bias towards the South, which is really frustrating. I'm sure y'all know about this, so I'm not telling you anything new that you don't know. But it's frustrating because, we're trying to do this work and we're trying to reach these communities and we don't have the data, which is again why I say, data can be flawed. And I think that anecdotal data is just as important as these sort of numbers and hard data, if you will. And that's something I used to tell advocates all the time, working at my sexual assault coalition, is that, you're seeing clients and survivors day in and day out. And because the census is only done every 10 years, some of this data can be old by the time we get to it and it's analyzed. Whereas because you're seeing people day in and day out, you see those changes much more quickly than data such as the census does. So that being said, according to the most recent US Census, so this is actually not the 2020 census where it got this data from, for this particular slide. It still hasn't been fully analyzed yet. So I'm actually working off of 2010 data as far as Latinos in Alabama. So, sorry, y'all. So it's according to the 2010 data, the population of folks who identify as Hispanic in Alabama increased from 3.9% to 5.3%. They are using the term Hispanic, so I'll use that term. And according to the Modern Language Association Language Map Data Center, it shows that Spanish is spoken by over 3% of the population, or 139,605 people. Again, that data is from 2010. Rebecca says, I'm not surprised at all that you couldn't find data on Latinos in Alabama. Thanks, Rebecca. It's so frustrating. And it makes it harder to do the work, right? When that data is so minimal. So the last piece of statistic that I have is more so on the South, because again, that information was so hard to find. And a report from the Pew Research Center shows that counties in the South continue to account for the largest share of the nation's Hispanic population growth, 43% between 2007 and 2014. And it says that we have a small decline from 44% between 2000 and 2007. So yeah, the South and Alabama in particular, y'all are just growing with Latino communities, which is awesome. I am going to, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second, just because I'm going to play a video and I want to make sure that y'all can hear the audio. Danielle says, I agree. I found that school demographic data provides a much better picture. That is really good to know. Thanks, Danielle. I will, I'll have to update my data in the future. All right. So I'm going to play a video. And this is about 3 minutes.
I identify as a Hispanic American.
Afro-Latina.
Mexican-American.
Chicana.
Mexican.
Afro-Latino.
To my family, I am Puerto Rican. To the country, I am Latina.
Growing up, I felt as though I was too Black to be Latina and too Latina to be Black.
Chicana, I think, identifies more of the political and social values that I hold more than just where my family's from.
I don't feel pressure to be more Latino or American. I'm comfortable with who I am, like culturally.
How can I be Mexican when I'm pressured to be more American? How can I be American when I'm pressured to be more Mexican?
My family, growing up, wanted me to, stick with my Hispanic roots, but also did not want me to show those roots to the world.
A lot of the times people didn't even know that I was Cuban because I guess I don't look like your typical Cuban.
My mom is Mexican, so I've always grown up with her culture, with her language, while being American doesn't come up as easily.
I've gotten people assume, even other Latinos assume that I'm white or that I'm not Latina or Chicana. It definitely hurts, but at the same time, it's not something that I can control. I think I can do my best to project that identity.
It's hilarious when you walk into a room and they don't think you're Caucasian enough, you're not American enough, you're not Latino enough.
Being Latino isn't as accepted as it should be.
It makes me feel pressured to fit a certain mold here in the United States. But now that I'm older, it's more like, it's what I make of it.
That doesn't stop me from being proud of who I am and where I'm from.
And then ultimately, I think what you settle on is how you view yourself.
We're kind of stripped in a lot of cases of our Spanish tongue and our Spanish heritage and told it's really important that you only speak English.
Because if you're from a Spanish-speaking country and you can't speak Spanish, it's harder for you to connect with the people there.
And not being ashamed when you do speak Spanish, but also not being ashamed if you weren't taught it.
Okay, so Spanish is not my first language because my parents were afraid of me being discriminated against because they were discriminated against. And now they're hurting me because I'm not Latino enough because Spanish is not my first language. But they don't know that I couldn't speak Spanish because my parents were afraid of me getting hurt.
My parents have already done all the work for me. And that's why I feel like I have like a bright future ahead of me because the work's already been done. All I have to do is like harvest what has been put on the ground.
But it's about me and other Afro-Latinos working really hard and continuing to make strides.
I feel like this country has a lot of opportunity for me.
When you have pushed another human being towards the light, towards positivity, towards a voting booth, towards using their power, you are powerful.
People are telling us as Hispanics that we don't belong here. That's kind of motivated us to join together as a Hispanic community and say, we do belong here. And despite what you're saying, I will prove to you why I do belong here.
All right. Thanks, Aileen. I love this video too, just because it kind of highlights some of what we talked about earlier in terms of terminology, but it also expands Latino identity to talk about racial identity as well, right? As I said before, we're not a monolith. And because Latino is not, often Latinos, even though Latino is not a racial category, it's considered a cultural or ethnic category. Thanks, Geronda. It's often racialized, even for folks who may be considered white and Latino. They're often, here in the US, are often racialized as other, because oftentimes the default race here is white, right? So, just technology, here we go. All right, so yeah, I think it's really important to talk about the multiracial identity amongst Latinos in the US, also beyond, obviously, because yeah, you don't want to, you want to make sure that you try to encompass as much as you can, or everything that you can about a person's identity. So a lot of us identify either as multiracial or as not as white. That statistic has decreased by 52%. And in 2020, 26.2 million Latinos identified their race as some other race alone. And part of that is because we're learning more information and things are changing. So people start to, as they realize, like, okay, maybe I've miscategorized myself, or they may have been miscategorized. People are starting to be more accurate about why that is. And that's important for us within our community, but it's also important for non-Latino folks to understand that as service providers, because you know, all communities can be really diverse and contain a lot of multitudes, if you will. And so it's critical that we understand what Latino means and how that intersects with race, and expanding it to include Afro-Latinos, and that's becoming more important. That approximately, in the most recent Pew Research report, says that approximately 6 million US adults identify as Afro-Latino. Most identify as Hispanic or Latino, but not all do so. Oh, thanks, Rebecca. Rebecca says, not to overshare, but as a proud Boricua, growing up was difficult because I can't speak Spanish fluently, so I was an outcast. I'm really sorry to hear that. It's not oversharing. I'm sorry that you felt that people outcasted you. That really stinks, because Spanish is not the only thing that identifies us as Latinos or Boricuas, or however we identify. You know, we are a really amazing multi-ethnic, multiracial community, and Spanish is not the only thing that identifies us as that. So I'm really sorry that that happened to you, but I appreciate you sharing your experience. That's really important, because as you're welcome. As Gina Rodriguez said in the video, her parents told her not to speak Spanish because of discrimination, and that is common, right? For folks here, you know, people want to make sure that their kids are safe. So that's something to consider too, right? Is not assuming that everybody that is Latino speaks Spanish, because there are a lot of folks who are indigenous, for example, who may not necessarily identify as Latino, even though they're from Latin America. And it was hard to find data on folks who identify as indigenous and Latino. So that unfortunately is not here. But that also brings me, I just wanted to briefly talk about colorism within Latino communities. Often this is an intra-community conversation. It's something that happens within, I think most often within communities of color. I think it's really important that non-Latino folks understand how colorism plays a role, because lighter skinned people, regardless of racial category, are going to experience privilege, unfortunately, right? Because of how things play out. So according to more Pew Research, they do a lot of research, which is really helpful. Latinos have said that having darker skin hurts Latinos' ability to get ahead, and having lighter skin helps Latinos' ability to get ahead. And that skin color can shape daily life experiences, and discrimination based on race or skin color is a very big problem in the US. Obviously, this is US data. This is not exclusive to the US, right? This happens in Latin America and beyond. So it's really important that we as service providers understand that, especially those of us who are white and lighter skin, because that bias that we talked about earlier, and those assumptions and victim blaming, that's going to play a role, right? We may look at someone who's darker skin and be like, oh, what did they do? You know, what were they doing that this happened to them, versus saying, how can I help? Aileen says, I totally identified to avoid discrimination. My parents made English only rule because we were in Alabama. Also a proud Boricua, but never considered Latina enough, or in Alabama, never fully assimilated American. Thank you for sharing that. I'm really sorry to hear that. Jimena says, this happens even in my country. Absolutely. Yes. As someone who's Dominican, I come from a predominantly Black country, and being a lighter skinned or whiter skinned person, I know that that has allowed me a lot of privilege myself. So it's something that we need to be conscious of, because like power, right, that shifts depending on where you are. Sometimes what's considered lighter skinned or dark skin can change depending on where you are. We could probably do a whole presentation just on colorism alone. I wish I could talk more about it, but I also want to make sure that we get to some of the other slides. So that leads us to talk about identity, right? And we've kind of talked a little bit about how identity can overlap and how it intersects, and how it impacts the individual, or more so, not so much that identity impacts an individual, because a person's identity, thanks, Rebecca. I would love to talk about it too. A person's identity is their identity, right? Like, that's just what it is. It's more so the systems, right? The isms is what helps cause that violence, right? So when a person's identities overlap or intersect, it can sometimes mean that they, depending on how many identities they overlap or intersect with, can impact how much violence they face, right? So someone who is like a queer disabled person may experience more violence than a cisgender, straight person. And then add in these other aspects like socioeconomic class and, all these things, right? Race, ethnicity. So it's really important to understand how these things all kind of connect together, and how they sort of overlap or intersect. And it'll also, the intersection of systems as it interacts with individuals as well, right? The help seeking or things like that, it's going to look different for different people. So I'm going to move along to some facts about intimate partner violence. That's what we tend to focus on at Esperanza United. We are starting to talk more about sexual assault specifically, but a lot of these data points are about intimate partner violence or domestic violence. So, and this data tends to focus on women, Latina women, but as we see here, we do have some data about LGBTQ folks and Hispanic men. So 1 in 3 Latinas, or 34.4%, will experience IPV during her lifetime, and 1 in 12 Latinas, 8.6%, has experienced IPV in the previous 12 months. That was a 2020 report from Esperanza United. LGBTQ folks fall victim to IPV at equal or even higher rates compared to their heterosexual counterparts, according to the National Center Against Domestic Violence. And 18.5% of Hispanic men experience some form of sexual violence in their lifetime. And as we know, like I said earlier, there's a lot of underreporting of violence. So these, in addition to underreporting of people's other things and other data, notoriously sexual assault is underreported, and I think domestic violence as well. So these numbers may actually even be higher, right? Oh, Spanish slide. Okay, so knowing the violence that occurs, and we kind of talked a little bit about this earlier, but I would love if folks would chime in the chat. What are some of the barriers that can exist for survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence? And I think we know some of them considering this conference, but if anybody wants to chime in with other barriers that may exist. I'll give folks a minute to think and chime in. Distrust of the police force, absolutely. Especially depending on where people come from, right? If you are from a place where there's a lot of corrupt police, you may not trust the police to help you, right? Religion, yeah. Yeah, sometimes your faith leaders may discourage you from getting help. I think most faith leaders are helpful, but sometimes we have that misinformation, access to resources based on status. Absolutely, right? Being undocumented could be a barrier. Being shunned from or in their community, yes, absolutely. Cultural, religious expectations to stay in the relationship, yes. Mental illness, depression, anxiety, PTSD. I think if the victim doesn't have enough courage, absolutely. Latina women are taught to be submissive and stay in the relationship for the kids. Yes, lack of good interpreters to assist with communication. Awesome answers, y'all. And I think y'all hit all the points that are on the slide. Yeah, yeah. Discrimination, economic and employment challenges. Culturally, men and even women are taught to keep things private because of upbringing. Absolutely, right? What happens in this house stays in this house. Been told stuff like that all my life, right? Lack of finances or resources to care for children if they leave. Absolutely, yes. Isolation from family and community. Yeah, these are all things that can impact, and those things can be heightened depending on different parts of people's identities or status. And then if all those things come together, right, how likely is it that a survivor is going to reach out and get help, right? Probably not going to be very likely if you have all these things stacked against them, right? And then we have systemic barriers too, which are kind of, we kind of talked about a little bit, but just wanted to highlight. For generation to generation, they think the husband can do whatever they want because they're together. Absolutely, right? That's why some people for a long time didn't understand that marital rape is something that occurred, right? For example, that because you are married to someone that you must have sex with them, right? And that's not true. You have autonomy over your body, regardless of marital status. And this speaks to, some of these statistics speak to the lack of knowledge about available resources in their community as a common barrier. 14% of participants reported experiencing problems in accessing IPV services due to immigration issues. Some reported that they were denied IPV services for lack of proper identification, right? So these things continue to stack up, right? So you have quote unquote individual barriers. They're not really individual barriers. They're more systemic, but these are more clear systemic barriers, right? And help seeking. So we use the term acculturated. Acculturated is, I've seen a couple of different definitions, but I think the definition that we're using is about how much a person has, basically acculturation refers to the process that occurs when groups of individuals of different culture come into continuous firsthand contact, which changes the original culture patterns of a person, right? So a person that is low acculturated, as in they haven't, maybe adopted as many of the cultural customs of the US or language, are less likely to seek and use formal social services than their more acculturated counterparts. And Latina and Black women were less likely to seek mental health services compared to white women. So even though this help exists, right, it's hard for people to get it, just because they may be on a different, on the continuum, they may be in a different place. Contextual factors. So we kind of talked about this, the cultural values, acculturation, religion, economic factors, all these different things. Yes, it's unheard of for them to seek help. Absolutely. Why would I tell a stranger about this thing that's happening in my home? It feels counterintuitive to do that. So all these factors come together to create barriers for people to seek services, right? So you have this person, so this particular, on the screen, we have this particular person who, let's say she's a Latina queer immigrant, right? And maybe she's out, maybe she's not, But she has to interact with all these institutions to get help. That's so much. That's overwhelming for one person to have to do all of that. It's a lot. So just let's keep that in mind as we move forward. I'm going to just talk about the framework really quickly because I'm almost at time. I apologize. So the framework that we developed, it kind of looks a little bit similar to the previous slide, right? You have Latinas, and because we're an organization founded by Latinas, and this was developed about almost 10 years ago, we're using the terminology of Latinas. Obviously, we can expand this to include anybody that is Latina or Latinx, right? They're experiencing violence, them and their families, right? And the advocate and the organization, this is a lot less stressful than that other, that the previous image. So an advocate with a depth of Latino cultural knowledge and understanding and appreciation, plus the organization's policies and procedures, service frameworks that are designed to embrace and build on Latino cultural realities, means that it leads to action to help the survivor. It's really important, right, as the role of an effective domestic violence advocate is to listen to a survivor, to support them in their decisions and be creative. And it can be summarized in being patient, proactive, positive, and a problem solver. It's much more than just speaking Spanish or being Latina or understanding cultural differences. It's a framework, but it's also a mindset on how we approach people. So this sort of represents how we have done Latina advocacy, but obviously this continues to change because, like culture, the framework is dynamic because we're dynamic. Just a comparison of domestic violence advocacy models. I think the one on the right is really what we're always trying to achieve, right? We want to believe in the strength of a participant within the context of family and community, because as we've seen and as y'all responded, right, family is really important. It's really central. So if the family is not able to be part of this solution, they're probably not going to seek help, right? So it has to be family centered. It has to be collective, right? And apologize for going through this so quickly. I just want to make sure that y'all have time for a break. I should be wrapping up in a minute or two. Latina cultural context and advocacy. So the lens informs their successes, challenges, goals, and needs. And the cultural context and lens shapes the type of support, advocacy, and services that a Latina seeks, as well as the choices that she makes. Thanks, Rebecca. Let's move on to the next slide. The importance of strengths-based advocacy. So this is something that we talk a lot about. Like everything that we do, you know, we really try to focus on strengths-based advocacy. Because even in focusing on the strengths, people will tell you sort of the quote negative things. I use quotes because some things are just what they are, and you know, we can assign them words and terminology, but it just is, right? So we don't necessarily, even if it's negative, it just is, right? But the strengths-based advocacy is about listening and learning from the collective voices of Latinas, acting, analyzing, adjust, create, and then you want to repeat that process. And I think the important thing that I really like about this is that it, in quotations for analyze, you see it's with Latinas, right? So everything that we're doing it with the survivor, right? We're not trying to like save this person, right? And I think we know these things, but it's always a good reminder that, as I said earlier, a survivor has had their power taken away from them when they've experienced this violence. So you want to make sure that when you are approaching their healing process or helping them, that you're working with them rather than for them. I mean, you are in some in some ways working for this person, but you don't want to do it in place of them, right? You want them to be part of the process because that helps them reclaim their power, right? So it's really important that when you're doing things, just to sort of slow down and remember, am I doing this with them? Are we focusing on their strengths, or am I doing this, making these decisions for them? And Spanish slide. So that leads me to ask, what type of organization are you? So there's different types of organizations. Whichever you are, it's not a bad thing or a good thing. That just, like I said, it just is, right? It's not negative, it's just where you are. And it's good to know where you are so you can work towards something else, right? If you want to go from being a mainstream organization to a culturally humble organization, you have to think about where you are. Just like when we talked about earlier about the cultural continuum, whether you're culturally responsive or culturally, you have practiced cultural humility or cultural responsiveness, you have to know where you are in order to move to a different part of that continuum. So I'm just going to define these really quickly. A mainstream organization represents the majority culture, usually Caucasian or white, the individuals who have assimilated, and institutions that hold power. It's usually led predominantly by those individuals from the majority culture, using mainstream values as a basis for decision-making process and procedures. A culturally affirming organization has a deep appreciation for the value that culture brings to its staff, operations, management, and leadership, and reflects this appreciation in decision-making process and procedures. The organization understands the profound impact of culture in the lives of its internal and external constituents. People and communities of color feel welcomed and respected in this organization. Culturally specific, which is how Esperanza United identifies and how a lot of our grantees on some of our projects identify, is an organization that fully reflects one's cultural or / racial group's reality. This reflection is seen throughout the organization through a majority representation of staff, supervisors, senior management, and board of directors. Decision-making process and procedures clearly reflect cultural and racial realities, though they may differ from mainstream models. And culturally humble, multicultural is sort of, ooh, sorry, y'all. Multicultural is kind of self-explanatory. You have folks obviously from different cultural backgrounds, but you're also using different cultural practices throughout the policy procedures, etc., decision-making. Culturally responsive is you're responding to the culture, kind of going back to what we talked about earlier. And then culturally humble is you're kind of, you're not finished, right? You know that you will always have work to do in terms of decision-making, process, procedures, you know, what your staff looks like. And the reality is that most organizations are probably a little bit of all of these things, or not just one of these things, because, you know, you have different people that bring who they are to the work. But I think, like I said, it's important to identify where you are and what elements of each you may have, so you can work towards, and then decide, what do we want to become? Do we want to become multicultural? Do we want to become culturally humble? And then work towards that. And then lastly, I think the important thing to ask yourselves and organizationally is, who's not in the room? Who is missing here? Because if those folks aren't present in the work, you're not going to be able to serve them. And I know it can be hard sometimes to try to include everyone. I think it's in terms of if you're looking at your organization and thinking about, where do we want to be organizationally? Do we want to be, say, multicultural? Who's not here that we need to include so that we can get there? that was a lot of information that I just added on there. So I just want to make time for questions if we have it. I know I'm about 10 minutes over. I also want to put my email in the chat. Sorry, y'all. I'm trying to manage 2 screens and I'm doing it a little not great, but I'm also going to put my, and I'm also just going to share all my references. But like I said, I will send that out, but I want to put my email in the chat so folks can reach out to me if they have any questions. That was a lot, but I want to thank all of you for listening and being here and your questions and your input. And thank Rebecca and Melissa and Ashakiran, as well as the interpreters.
All right, do you want to see if anybody has any questions? Did you already ask that? I'm sorry if you did.
I did, but no need to apologize. I feel like I sped up there at the end. I apologize. But also, if
great.
Thank you. I also want to respect the time. I know I went over, and I think you have a scheduled break. So if folks want to reach out to me personally, you can. You know, you might need a. Maria asks, how are you able to manage your personal feelings when you are serving clients of domestic violence? Ooh, I'm gonna be honest with you. Sometimes it's been hard, and it requires skill building around boundaries, which is not like the easiest answer in the world because it's not immediate. It means that you have to constantly, like cultural humility, constantly work on yourself. But you have to remind, like one of the things I like to ask myself is like, if I'm sort of being biased, is where is this coming from? Am I projecting this from my own experience, especially those of us that are survivors ourselves? Because sometimes we may project our own experience onto other survivors. So you may want to sit with that and why that is. I think it also helps to debrief with whether it's your supervisor or other service providers that have someone that you trust and ask them like, hey, do you think I'm being biased? But that also requires some self-awareness. So I think you have to build, I mean, I think if you're asking the question, you have self-awareness, but you may want to work on building your self-awareness, and that may mean some professional training or collaborating with your colleagues to, if you're kind of struggling to find that professional training, maybe they can help you with that, with finding that training that you may need. I hope that's helpful. I'm also happy to talk one-on-one since we do provide training and technical assistance as an organization. So don't hesitate to reach out. Happy to help.
Thank you so much.